Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for a conference on the global governance of plastic pollution, transforming the global plastics economy. Welcome to all of you who've joined us for the first time, and a special thanks for those who are joining us again who attended yesterday. I'm going to switch us straight over now to Alice Tipping, who is the moderator for this session on trade policies and their role in plastic pollution reduction efforts. Alice is the lead on sustainable trade and fisheries subsidies at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Alice, thank you for joining us, and you have the floor.
Super, and thank you very much indeed, Carolyn. It's a delight to be moderating this session on a topic very close to my heart. I'm also delighted to be joined by a panel of very distinguished experts, each of whom I think are going to bring a useful and distinct perspective on this particular issue. So what are we going to hear? Today we're going to hear about a range of different perspectives on how existing international frameworks reflect the use of trade policy as a tool in addressing the plastic pollution challenge. We're going to hear first from Amelie TAOUFIQ from the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions about how these three multilateral environmental agreements are being used in synergy to address trade in plastics. Then we're going to hear from Brigitta Amelie from the World Trade Institute about the particular challenges presented by trade and plastic waste, and also about the implementation of the Basel Convention and its relationship to WTO rules. Staying on the theme of WTO rules, we'll then hear from Aik-Ho Lim, the Director of the Trade and Environment Division at the World Trade Organization, who will help us understand how WTO members are currently using that organization's framework, and in particular its notification function, to share information with each other about trade measures they have in place to deal in particular with plastic waste. And now, while we have a lot of data, and we'll hear about data on transboundary movement of plastic waste and other plastic materials, one thing I think the research is also telling us is that there is a lot we don't know about trade in plastic, and there are in fact large hidden flows of plastic in international trade. So we'll have the benefit then of hearing from Paola PARUTA from Environmental Action to help us understand, in a sense, how much we don't know about plastic trade. And then last but certainly not least, I'll be pleased to give the floor to Carolyn, DEERE, who needs no introduction to this audience, of course, but she is a senior researcher at the Graduate Institute and the organizer of this conference on the governance of plastics. So she will walk us through a range of trade policy options that governments have to address plastic pollution to round us off. A note to our audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of the screen. A note to the speakers, you're also encouraged to answer the questions that you see coming up in the Q&A box as we go along. If we have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A and discussion, I'll pull out any particularly interesting questions and put them to one of you. And as a last note to the speakers, I will be keeping time. We do have a lot of material to get through, so I will give you a quick warning if you've gone over the 7-minute limit, and that'll be your signal to skip to the key takeaways that you'd like the audience to have in their minds if you haven't already said them. So with that brief scene setter, I might hand the floor first then to Amelie, please. Amelie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Virtually and to start, I will briefly talk about what the framework of the Basel Rotterdam Convention, Paris Convention, without this chemical it has to offer to help tackling plastic. As you may be aware, there have been major developments.
Amelie, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Could you just try to speak maybe a little bit slower? Let's see if the connection can pick up your microphone better.
Okay. Better now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Mentioning frameworks of the conventions.
I'm so sorry, Amelie. We're having some trouble hearing you still. Could you see if we could change microphone settings? Let's see if we can just go to a different one just to see if you just switch up and down again to the microphone, and hopefully the connection will be better just by the switch.
Okay. Let me try. Would it be better this way, or can you hear me better?
We can hear you. Yes, this is a little more stable. Just speak loudly. I think with this microphone, just speak really loud, but we can hear you. At least it's stable.
Okay, and this way?
Yeah, we can still hear you, just as loud as possible.
Okay. So to come back on the most recent developments under the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, as you may be aware, there have been some striking COP decisions in 2019. There should have been some additional ones this year, but the substantive part of the meetings of the Conference of the Parties that were supposed to take place this year have been postponed, hopefully to June 2022 face-to-face. So this is why I'm referring now to the decisions that have been adopted a couple of years ago. But the important thing to highlight is that they have started being effective as from the 1st of January 2021, so this year. There are two sets of important decisions. First, what is called the Plastic Waste Amendments, which are the first and so far only ambitious actions to tackle the environmental and health challenges posed by plastic waste under a legally binding instrument. So I don't want to enter into too many technical details, but by means of these three amendments to the annexes to the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, this decision specifies the categories of plastic waste that will be subject to the Convention's core mechanism, which is the prior informed consent procedure for transboundary movements to happen, as well as the conditions under which this procedure applies or not. These decisions also specify the provisions that pertain to plastic waste minimization and to the environmentally sound management of these plastic waste. The second major recent development that took place also in 2019, thanks to the parties to the Basel Convention, is the one that established the Plastic Waste Partnership. And its objective is to improve and promote the environmentally sound management of plastic waste at the global, regional, and national levels, as well as to prevent and minimize their generation. To date, there are 23 pilot projects that are overseen by these partnerships, Plastic Waste Partnership. And the work of the also called PWP is overseen by a working group which established 4 project groups on plastic waste prevention and minimization, plastic waste collection, recycling and other recovery, including financing and related markets. Third, transboundary movements of plastic waste. And fourth, the outreach, education and awareness raising on plastic waste. So the advantage of these partnerships, Plastic Waste Partnership, is to provide a forum for civil society, academia, and the private sector to work hand in hand with governments of parties to the Basel Convention to address the issue of plastic waste as a source of land and marine pollution. Regarding the opportunities towards more sustainable trade in plastic waste and less plastic pollution, at 3 levels, global, regional, and national levels, because these MUs, the BRS conventions, are indeed global tools, but they require national implementation. And within the legal and policy framework that is offered under the Basel Convention mainly, in synergies with the Stockholm Convention and the Rotterdam Convention, we'll see why a bit later, there are incredible opportunities that lie there for the realization of important benefits towards more environmentally friendly trade in plastic waste and towards more sustainable trade in plastics. The Stockholm Convention deals with POPs, persistent organic pollutants, that are used in plastics, so hazardous chemicals. For example, flame retardants, plasticizers, further additives are currently under review by the technical and scientific body under the convention. And therefore, the work that is being done under this convention is also key, hand in hand with the Basel Convention. There are also opportunities that the Rotterdam Convention could be offered, and as you also may be aware, this convention offers a platform for trade and to exchange information on trade of certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides, also using similar procedures than the Basel Convention, which is the prior informed consent procedures, and up to parties to indeed address plastic under this convention as well, the trade of plastics. So what's important to highlight is that as offered by for example, the PWP, the Plastic Waste Partnership, a 360-degree approach, multi-stakeholder approach is essential, and the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions have started offering such a collaboration, such a platform. It's the beginning of the journey, it's not the end. Forthcoming meetings of the Conference of the Parties offer other opportunities next year. And what is important to note is that collaborations with other key stakeholders, international organizations, the private sector, non-governmental organization at all levels, regional, national, and global, is critical to tackle plastic pollution. Of course, training and capacity building, education, awareness raising is needed, and the BS conventions offer actions for parties to adopt more decisions in that sense, and vision and bold actions by governments are highly needed to tackle the plastic pandemic, which is now exacerbated by unique demands caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So to conclude, we've heard a lot about the option of the global MEA specific to plastic. There's of course merit in having such a global tool as part of the solution, but the BIS conventions, I believe, as an advocate for these MEAs, they promote the use and improvement of existing tools by using more of these existing tools and improving them. In addition to think of other innovative solutions like a global treaty, these are options to be looked at together, hand in hand, because they form key pieces of a puzzle that need to be put together between all the mutually supportive initiatives, processes, and we'll see with the next speakers how this could work. Thank you for the opportunity to share the BIS perspective on this.
Super, thank you, Amelie. You were perfectly to time. And I think it's hearing about it again, it's actually a very useful reminder for those of us who are very familiar with the trade policy context to look over at the MEA approach to some of these issues and be reminded how important engagement by stakeholders and by industry and by environmental and NGO groups is in resolving some of these policy questions. Not something that you see so often on the trade policy side of the discussion. So a useful reminder in particular for me, because this is the side I come from. So thank you, Amelie, that was extremely helpful. Perhaps I'll give the floor next to Brigitta to help us to link kind of the BRS framework and its legal construct with WTO rules. Brigitta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice, and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Brigitta Amelie. I am a PhD candidate at the World Trade Institute, and I'm delighted to be on this panel today. International trade plays a central role across the life cycle of plastics, from fossil fuel stocks for the fabrication of virgin plastic through the distribution of plastics embedded in products or as packaging. But for the next couple of minutes, I invite you to focus on what happens at the last stage of this cycle and talk about the trade flows in plastic waste and what the Basel Convention and the multilateral trade rules have to say on this. First, I will give a general overview on how plastic waste moves between countries. Then we briefly explore the Basel Convention and its plastic amendments. And lastly, how this multilateral environmental agreement complements rather than conflicts with WTO rules. But before we start, let me thank for the support of my supervisor, Dr. Ilaria Espa, with whom I worked together on this topic, but who can't participate today. As to the trade flows, there is a traditional north-to-south pattern in plastic waste trade, meaning that developed countries have been the primary exporters of plastic waste during the last 2 decades, contributing to over 80% of all exports, while main importing countries are in East Asia and the Pacific, with China as a main destination, which imported nearly half of the world's plastic waste since the early 90s. One argument or reason behind this approach is that allowing the export of waste plastics to countries with a comparative cost advantage in sorting or recycling can help boost global recycling rates, while also generating increased shared economic benefits and improved environmental outcomes. However, seeing the north-south pattern, it is also important to mention that waste mismanagement occurs predominantly in middle and low-income countries, while developed countries, to a certain extent, achieved improved waste management by exporting the problem. Exports of plastic waste towards destinations with limited recycling capacity and less stringent treatment standards expose the affected receiver countries to negative environmental impacts and result in detrimental effects on the global scale. For instance, in 2015, it was estimated that from the Chinese coastlines, somewhere between 1.3 and 3.5 million tons of metric tons of plastic entered the sea. There would be more to say, but I believe this already illustrates that the unregulated transboundary trade in plastic waste poses a problem of global dimensions. Yet, until recently, there has been no specific instrument dealing with transboundary plastic waste trade. This brings me to our second topic, the plastic amendments to the Basel Convention we just heard about. The amendments clarify the convention's coverage, setting clear that plastic waste, except uncontaminated pre-sorted plastic materials prepared and suitable for immediate recycling, are subject to the convention's strict rules. These clarifications will support parties in identifying the types of waste subject to the transboundary movement restrictions and in their determination of whether they wish to agree to such movements, including to assess whether they have capacity to manage imports. In this way, the Basel Convention and the plastic amendments will contribute to a more sustainable trade in plastics. However, such measures will likely restrict international trade as well, at least as we understand it in the WTO context. Which brings me to my last point. Why are the plastic amendments to the Basel Convention relevant for the multilateral trade community and for WTO lawyers in particular? The reason for this is that plastic waste is a good with certain economic value and thus subject to the multilateral trade rules. These rules say, for instance, that WTO members should not put in place measures that limit the quantity of imports or exports, and should not put in place product requirements, such as the purity of plastic scrap, that treat imports worse than, in this example, domestic plastic scrap, or technical requirements which are overly trade restrictive. However, there are exceptions from these rules available, for instance, for measures that are necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life and health, or for measures that relate to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. These exceptions are tied to certain demanding requirements, and the Basel Convention as a multilateral environmental agreement helps trade lawyers to interpret these exceptions. For instance, the first question for the justification of a trade restrictive measure is whether it is indeed designed to achieve its stated policy goals. And here, opinions may differ. For instance, when China in 2018 introduced measures that actually halted imports of plastic waste, it was argued by some exporting countries that these restrictions harm the environment and human health because there are no recycling capacities in exporting countries, and these scheduled exportations will end up in landfills or incineration instead of being recycled in China. But the Basel Convention indicates that trade control measures are a justifiable response to the global plastic problem agreed on by the international community. So as a last point, I'd like to underline that the Basel Convention rules do not conflict with WTO rules, but complement each other and serve as an important means of interpretation when clarifying the WTO agreement. Again, there would be more to say, but I'm afraid that my time is running out. So I'll pass the word to the next speaker, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Brigitta. You were in fact a minute under, so you've done extremely well. And thank you also for the reminder, which would be an interesting thing perhaps to come back to in the discussion about exactly how the Basel Convention's provisions complement multilateral trade rules rather than conflicting with them. As a WTO lawyer, it's been a topic of consistent interest for me, exactly how WTO rules, as they've been interpreted, have made a real effort to take cognizance of environment that WTO members and other fora have decided what is an environmental priority, right? And the fact that members should take measures to protect the environment. The question is how those relate to WTO rules. So now that we're firmly perhaps in the space of WTO rules and how they work, perhaps it's time for me to pass the floor to IISD. As the director of the WTO's Trade and Environment Division, you have an extremely good sense of how the question of plastic pollution is coming up. So perhaps I'll offer you the floor to talk about how it's come up in the WTO context. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Alice. Great to be here and great to share this panel with the other experts. I'll be using a few slides, so let me hope that this is going to work. I'll try to share my screen with you. And is it working? Do you see the screen? Okay, good. I'm always very nervous when I share screens. It never quite works all the time. Listen, I won't be very long, or at least I'll try not to be very long, but I thought the best way to answer the question about trade and plastic-related measures is actually to be as empirical as we can and not dwell too much on principles. So what we have done is to look at actual measures that have been notified, and we have one resource for doing this, which is the environmental database. So what do we see with the environmental database is we look at all agreements, actually, all notifications, to mention that. And the first is maybe just stating the obvious, is that we see that there's an increase in our database of figures from 2009 and 2019. I should also put a caveat. This is simply measures notified to the WTO. There's possibly many more measures out there that are not notified to the WTO. So look at these figures just in terms of a trend rather than absolutes, I think. So we see both on notifications, an increase in the average number of notifications that could be plastics related. That's the smaller bar chart on the left. And we also look at trade policy reviews, where we actually study the trade policy review and see what type of measures are discussed. And here we see an increase in plastic related measures as well. Very quickly, I'm talking here over this period of something like 130 trade measures notified to the WTO. What's interesting is that about 80% of these measures have been notified by developing and LDC members. What agreements are we talking about? We're mainly talking about TBT and SPS agreements, at least from our look at our environmental database. Then the next slide will talk a little bit more about the types of measures. Since we're talking mainly about TBT and SPS measures, as far as our database is concerned, of the measures notified, you can split it further, And here the large chunk is our technical regulations or specifications, followed by conformity assessment procedures. So we're in a very regulatory sphere, regulatory measures and those which fall under TBT and SBS. And we went a little bit further to try to understand this a little bit more. And, you know, this again, I think is quite interesting. If you look at this sort of chart, looking at what part of the value chain are we talking about? The top of this is looking at primary plastics, plastic-based inputs, finished goods, and it goes down towards recycling. So the large number of measures that are notified are more in the so-called downstream part of the value chain, some 80%, okay? This probably correlates with other research and other things that people are talking about, suggesting a lot of more policy action at this downstream part, less so, at least on our notifications, in terms of the upstream part, such as on primary plastics, plastic-based inputs, and so forth before they become actual finished goods. So that's a very, very quick and dirty analysis of what we have in the environmental database. But I think it helps to shed a bit more light on what measures are we talking about, what agreements are involved, what type of things are governments really doing, which could be considered trade related. And I think what's also interesting to note is that, you know, a lot of this is regular work of WTO. And I'm not talking about disputes or concerns, etc. I'm talking about members notifying. It's captured, it's in the system, and for the most part, you know, it's basically about transparency, policy sharing, and peer learning, and discussions through committees. Here, just to focus a bit on TBT and SBS, because, as I said, a lot of these measures are under these agreements. What's interesting in TBT and SBS are measures are notified before adoption, before the measure is actually adopted. There's a process in both TBT and SBS that allows members to provide comments before adoption of measure. And it's very actively used. And I think this type of mechanism is important because when we come to talk about regulatory issues, there's a great need for transparency, policy sharing, and in fact, to avert problems before they become a problem. So, and I think that's something to keep in mind. It's not always, in my view at least, you know, that evident to people that there's a huge mechanism in WTO that tries to solve a problem before it becomes a problem, and not just at the end of the value chain when it becomes a dispute as such. And so far, you know, a lot of interesting work here. Very last comment, since I was asked to say something about this, there is an ongoing process under the informal dialogue on plastics. It's a group of members who want to focus a discussion on how can trade support efforts to address plastics pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade. It's growing in terms of its work and has brought a lot of new information on the table, and they're working towards MC12. So that's it for me. So thanks very much, Alice, and look forward to joining the discussion.
Oh, super. Thank you very much indeed, Heiko. Again, impressively at time. Thank you. Maybe just two things to pull out that I found really interesting. And the first you alluded to towards the end, but it's again a useful reminder for those of us in the trade policy space, but also for those outside, is a reminder of just how important and well used the WTO's regular notification committee discussion function is. And while disputes and the legal rules might get a lot of attention, particularly from lawyers like me, actually many disputes, as you say, are likely resolved in the committees because members have the chance to talk to each other about a measure before it's enacted. And that's exactly what the committee function is meant to serve. So a useful reminder there about how useful that function is before you ever get to a dispute. And the second useful point that I've heard you make before, but it's always an interesting one to be reminded, is how many measures notified relate to the downstream part of the plastics value chain, right? 80% or so. And how many measures are notified by developing countries. And in a sense, as you were saying, it sort of reflects the general flow, at least of plastic waste that Brigitta was talking about just before, right? If a lot of plastic waste ends up in developing countries, it does seem from the notifications like many developing countries are making an effort to take measures to deal with this plastic waste, its recycling and how it's managed. So I thought those were two useful points just to pull out and make sure people had in their notes. So while it seems like we have some quite good information about trade in plastic, it's by no means complete, of course. So now I'm delighted to offer you the floor, Paola, to help us understand, I guess, what we might term the known unknowns of plastic trade. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you very much for having me here. And I think we can directly put up the presentation. So I'm Paola PARUTA and I work at EA, Environmental Action. We're based in Switzerland. This is the very end of the presentation. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm gonna talk about hidden trade flows of plastics around the world. So we can go to the next slide. So basically, I'm going to follow the usual introduction, methodology, results. So introduction, what is hidden plastic trade? What do we mean by that? Then the methodology, how do we track it? And finally, an estimate of this hidden trade with its limitations attached. So if we go to the next slide, what is hidden plastic trade? Next slide again. So basically, if we look at Comtrade database that tracks all kind of trade flows around the world, we usually have that plastic goods are labeled with code 39. So this is the non-hidden part, is all of the trade records that are under HS code 39, which stands for plastics and article thereof. This is mainly, by volumes, is mainly resins and primary plastics, but there are also intermediate products and packaging products such as bottles or bags or cutleries, things like that. And then waste would also be in this group, although I haven't mentioned it here. And then you have hidden plastic, and that's all other trades where plastic is not explicitly mentioned, but is part of the traded goods. So this could be prepackaged goods, like a tray of meat or juice bottles, these sort of things, or it can be plastic embedded in products like cars, textile, electrical and electronics, so on and so forth. So while evaluating the amount of non-hidden plastic that is traded is fairly easy, since we know what are the traded volumes, measuring the hidden part is more complicated because we know what's the traded good, but we don't know the plastic share in the goods. So we don't know overall how much plastic is traded in this hidden trade of plastic. And why is it important to focus on it? It's because it allows to compute correctly the plastic consumption. So for example, of a country. So for example, if you want to properly dimension the recycling facility in a country for plastic, then you need to know how much plastic is consumed. And for it, you need to know how much plastic goes in and out. And if you're missing a big slice of the plastic consumption because you're not considering the hidden plastic trade, then you might not know how much plastic is actually in the country. And there are other concerns, like in order to estimate plastic pollution, it's also important to know what's the total plastic consumption, because then if you know what's the total plastic consumption and waste generation, and on the other hand, you know how much of it is collected and properly disposed, then the difference would be everything that is kind of left into the environment. Next slide, please. And now, how can we track this hidden trade? And just for this presentation, I'm gonna present the approach based on the National Guidance for Plastic Pollution, Hotspotting and Shaping Action. This is a document by the United Nations done in collaboration with IUCN and the Life Cycle Initiative, in which we as EA collaborated as technical lead. And in this guidance, the ultimate aim of the guidance is to compute plastic pollution. But as I mentioned, in order to do so, then you also want to know what's the plastic consumption of the country to kind of perform a mass balance. So here what we did is that we estimated the hidden trade as the traded volumes in 1,000 tons, which is provided by Comtrade, although this we used BASI's database because it harmonized Comtrade database. And then the plastic content as a share of this traded volume. And the plastic content share is determined by literature review and depends on the HS code. So the type of hidden trade that are accounted for in this methodology are electrical and electronics, automotive, prepackaged food, household, leisure and sport, and textile. Next slide. Now, if we look at the results, and we can go to the next slide, we see that at global level, 20% of the trade is hidden. So of the 328 million tons of plastic that are traded worldwide, 66 million tons are hidden. So we could say, okay, the vast majority is non-hidden trade. But if we look at by country level, and if we go to the next slide, we see that at country level, the spread is much wider, and you have countries like China that are where only 5% of the trade is of hidden plastic. And then you have other countries like Congo where 52% of the trade is hidden plastic. And then we have some, let's say, outlier at the other extreme like Macau. But I believe this 99% of hidden trade in Macau is due to the fact that Macau is a trading hub for China, and then Lesotho at 93%. And here I'm looking at the hidden trade in imports of plastic. So if we look at this by region, and we go to the next slide, by region, we can see that China, that now includes also Macau and Hong Kong, is at 12% hidden trade, so it's the lowest amount. And then on the opposite hand, you have Africa with 38% of the plastic imported in hidden form. And the other regions are somewhere in between. I don't know if I still have a bit of time, but maybe one thing that I can say about this trend is that it seems to be linked to the manufacturing capacity of a country. So if a country has a good manufacturing capacity, then it's gonna rather import raw plastic under the 39 code of resins and then manufacture final goods within the country. Although if the manufacturing capacity is lower, then they're gonna tend to import finished goods that have plastic embedded in them or packaged goods. And this we can see a bit in the next slide, where we see that there is an inverse trend between the hidden trade and the manufacturing capacity of a region. So I would say that overall, accounting for this hidden portion is very important, especially for some countries more than others. But then there are some limitations in this approach. If we go to the next slide. So the main limitation is obviously that, except for the exception of textile, where although it's not under the 39 code, is clearly stated when there is a synthetic portion of textile in the traded good. In all other cases, we don't know exactly what is the plastic exchanged and what is the plastic share in the good. So then we have to estimate on our side the plastic share for each HS code. And this analysis that I presented was conducted based on the UNEP guidance, national guidance, but this was based on limited literature review. And I made that effort to use other approach to improve this plastic share, but for the moment, I don't have conclusive results. Some HS codes were not included and were not accounted for, like for example, prepackaged of non-food product or paint is 50% plastic, and additives were mentioned as well are not included, and furniture is not included in this approach. And then another underlying limitation would be just in general the reliability of the volume traded quantities income trade. And I think with this, I'm finished. Yes, thank you very much.
Super, thank you, Paola, and right on time as well. And I think, you know, those of us who work with a lot of trade data are under no illusions about just how difficult it must be to try and see into an HS code and try and estimate the amount of plastic that volume might contain. So great effort, and already really interesting, I think, to see the correlation between how much plastic countries probably import and how that relates to how much they manufacture themselves. So useful there. So I think this has given us a good range of different perspectives. And now I'm delighted to hand the floor to Carolyn, who's done a lot of very good thinking about how countries might use trade policy in particular to try and address some of these problems. So Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. So I want to walk briefly through some of the ways in which international policy could help tackle plastic pollution and some possible pathways for taking different options forward. So my presentation draws from research done by Mahesh Sugatan and I, with inputs from a range of experts, and including Alice here, as well as Reinhard Weisinger and Ronald Steenblick, among others. So it's a group effort, really. Now, much of the world's plastic products, components, feedstocks, and waste and recycled materials now crisscross borders along complex global supply chains. As I noted yesterday, UNCTAD analysis has shown that the annual value of trade in plastics amounts to over $1 trillion, representing at least 5% of global trade. And Paola has underscored that this is certainly an underestimate, as it doesn't capture the full value of hidden, or volume of hidden trade flows in plastics. Now, this trade matters for two reasons. First, because trade flows of plastic waste into countries with inadequate waste management capacity exacerbates the leakage of plastics into the environment. And trade also matters because trade in plastic products, as well as products containing embedded plastics and prepackaged in plastics, adds to the waste management burden of importing countries. So in terms of existing trade policies, we have two dimensions to consider. The first is that many governments are actively working through trade agreements to promote market access for their plastic products, so to expand their trade, and to use their trade policies to protect and support national plastic producers and exporters in competitive international markets. At the same time, on the plastic pollution front, as Ho has pointed out, governments are harnessing an array of trade policies and measures, some of which are very explicitly targeting trade, but others some of those trade measures are very explicitly trying to target plastic pollution, and others are domestic policies that can have trade implications, but are not directly trade policies per se. We could move to slide 2. Oh, sorry, slide 1. Sorry, the slide we're on. Sorry, stay with that. So, you know, while Ho's presentation highlights that there are a broadening array of countries that are using or considering the use of trade measures, a core problem that governments face is that because of the globalized nature of plastics production and consumption, there's limits to what they can accomplish on their own. So this slide highlights some of the gaps in international trade cooperation, including limits on data, as Paola has mentioned, and inadequate monitoring of trade flows. There's limited dialogue, so many of the national approaches are being developed in a piecemeal and uncoordinated manner on very specific parts of the plastic problem, but not really with a holistic approach. There's also poor transparency, which means that exporters active in the global plastics economy and those that we're trying to encourage to change their practices are increasingly facing a very diverging and confusing regulatory framework. So such untransparent and piecemeal efforts make it more difficult for them to make the transition to more sustainable use of plastics. And we have a range of different differences in regard to restrictions on specific plastic products, on sustainability standards, and on labeling. So more cooperation and more transparency would make it more effective. There's also a lack of policy coherence. So you have some trade policy frameworks that are not well aligned with domestic measures to reduce plastic pollution. So you find there are countries who are restricting or banning use of certain single-use plastics domestically, but are still exporting those overseas. And overall, the development dimensions of this plastics and trade question are widely neglected. So if we move to the next slide, looking ahead, we need to see how governments can use cooperation on trade and trade policy to create the right incentives and create the right markets for companies and consumers to produce, consume, and trade plastics more sustainably. So on this slide, I've set out a couple of options for trade policy cooperation that would promote a more informed and enabling environment. So the first is to address gaps in data on trade flows and to map these against capacity to manage different kinds of waste. The second is to further improve the transparency and reporting and notifications of trade-related measures, and also experiences and lessons learned from governments about what's proven effective and how they could be made more effective. The third is to support analysis and information sharing on different ways in which trade policy options could support reductions in plastic pollution and which of these could be enhanced through international cooperation. And critically here, it's also important to remember that some trade rules and policies may impede or undermine national plastic pollution reduction efforts, and we need to know more about them. Then the fourth enabling area is around boosting trade-related technical assistance and capacity building on plastic pollution, which is something that Amelie mentioned earlier. And this could take place through existing instruments, such as, for example, through the Basel Convention and its Plastic Waste Partnership. So on the next slide, we've also identified some concrete trade policy interventions that could make an impact. I will just run through these as swiftly as I can, Alice. The first is to promote trade in goods and services that can reduce plastic pollution. So this could include environmentally sound waste management technologies, non-plastic substitutes, services that reduce plastic consumption, such as those related to reuse and refill business methods, business models. We could promote trade in recycled plastic products. Secondly, we could promote restrictions, phase outs or bans of trade in hazardous, avoidable, unnecessary and problematic plastics, especially those that are non-recyclable and those that are banned or restricted domestically. This could be done through voluntary pledges. It need not be a new set of multilateral rules, but even pledges would help us move in the right direction. We could end trade in hazardous, mixed and contaminated plastic waste, which is obviously what the Basel Convention is trying to do, but while also facilitating responsible trade in recyclable plastics waste that's destined for certified, environmentally sound recycling facilities. And we could also look at how we can promote trade in environmentally sound plastic recyclates that can be used then in recycled plastic products. The other way in which trade cooperation can help is to identify where we need better international standards to underpin sustainable plastics trade, and also how we can improve the classifications of trade that underpin international trade statistics. And this would help governments to have a better picture of the trade flows coming in and out of their countries. We could promote coordination on policies and regulations on plastic packaging, which affects international supply chains, which might send better signals to international supply chains. And we could also promote coordination of transnational extended producer responsibility systems. And finally, there's a role in the trade arena for increasing the transparency of subsidies to fossil fuel feedstocks and virgin plastics production, and to look at ways in which governments could work together to reduce those. So the next slide, please. So this slide highlights that there are a number of different pathways through which this trade cooperation could be advanced. As Amelie mentioned, we have a range of international environmental processes, such as the Basel Convention. There's a proposal for a global treaty on plastic pollution, and we need to explore what more can be done through these existing instruments to promote more sustainable trade. There's also work underway at the WTO, as Ho has mentioned, in its regular work, and also this proposal for enhanced work and cooperation through the informal dialogue on plastic pollution. There are many other international organizations that have relevant pieces of the puzzle, like UNCTAD, the World Customs Organization, and the International Organization for Standardization. And finally, there's work that could be done at the regional level to develop regional approaches to certain restrictions or promotion of certain kinds of trade. And obviously at the national level, there's much that can be done. Countries can always take measures unilaterally, nationally, to better manage trade in plastics. So onto my final slide is, Ho, just to conclude, Ho has mentioned that a process has been launched at the WTO, the Informal Dialogue on Plastics Pollution and Environmentally Sustainable Plastics Trade. It's now co-sponsored by 17 countries. I need to add Costa Rica to this slide. So we have made some recommendations in our report about what specifically could be done at the WTO in addition to its regular work, but I won't have time to go into those now. The key point is that as the central multilateral organization charged with trade, the WTO is really uniquely positioned to provide a forum for governments to cooperate and think together on how they can better address plastic pollution. Already the IDP governments are looking at how they can support and add value to existing efforts. And at the moment, they're working to develop a ministerial statement on plastic pollution for the WTO Ministerial Conference in December. And they hope to identify some shared priorities and a work plan for moving forward. They're also looking to expand the number of members co-sponsoring their statement and joining their efforts at voluntary cooperation. So importantly, yesterday we heard that moving the plastic pollution agenda forward requires an all hands on deck approach and a systems change approach, taking up all available policy levers and expertise. So the trade and environment intersection is a clear example of where cooperation is needed, avoiding duplication, promoting synergies, and that will also require cooperation among relevant ministries at the national level and between environment and trade policy making processes. So I hope I've provided a few ideas about where we could go next. Thank you, Alice.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, very much. That was an excellent overview of what I know is a really comprehensive report, and we were delighted to contribute a little bit of the thinking to it, though not too much credit. You know, I think I'd like to come back perhaps to one of the very first things you said, which I think is an important sort of rationale for a discussion about trade policy in addressing plastics pollution. And it's the fact, as you mentioned at the beginning, that the global plastics economy is exactly that. It is a global plastics economy. Plastics are produced in more concentrated places, but used in manufacturing and used in a consumer sense and in a business sense all over the world. And there is so much trade of plastic sort of per feedstock, but also plastic in goods and goods themselves, that trying unilaterally to address it will only have so much impact. I think there's such a strong argument for cooperation here that it's a useful message for the trade policy community. And looking back at your list of trade policy options, and I know you've heard me say this before, but in my mind, a lot of them sort of fall into four kind of functions, I guess, for trade policy, right? There's the first function, which as trade policy people we're not often used to thinking about, and it's the idea of restricting trade, be it in hazardous plastics or hazardous waste or an unnecessary or problematic plastic packaging, right? So using policy, including trade policy tools, to actually restrict problematic plastic trade is the first function. And the second, of course, on the other side is promoting trade, right, in alternatives to plastic or more recyclable plastic, which takes us directly into the question of standards and how well we can differentiate plastic. And that's just in looking at the actual plastic that's being traded currently, right? The fourth or the third function, I think, could be the idea of promoting trade in goods and services that help to manage plastics, right? Once they have gone through their life cycle, what do we do with them? And there's a range of goods and services, obviously, and this is sort of the more classic environmental goods and services discussion. How can we use trade policy to increase access to the goods and services countries need to manage plastics once they're already on their territory? So that's sort of the three of the functions. And the last one you mentioned right at the beginning, or sorry, right at the end of your slides, but I thought I'd pull it out and highlight it, is the idea of looking at subsidies. And I know that you had a session on this yesterday afternoon, which was great, looking and underlining how important the question of subsidy is, of course, a policy tool governed by the WTO agreements, but how important the question of subsidies along the value chain could be to reshaping the global plastics economy. So for me, kind of a lot of the policy options fitted into those four big buckets. So I thought I'd put that out there to the audience in case it helps people to follow along. Miraculously, we have a bit of time for Q&A. And so if you have additional questions you'd like to put to some of the presenters, please do put them in the Q&A box. There's already a lively discussion in there that you can see. And perhaps while I wait for a few more questions to come in, because we have some minutes, I know that Brigitta had a few more points that she wanted to include in the discussion, precisely coming back to this question of the interaction between the Basel Convention and its amendments on plastic and the WTO rules. So given that we have a bit of time, perhaps Brigitta, I can give you back the floor. And then while she's speaking, I'll keep an eye on the Q&A box. And if any of the other speakers have any reactions to what they've heard that they'd like to chip in, please put your hands up and I'll keep an eye on the hands raised and the Q&A box. But until then, Brigitta, the floor's yours for a few more minutes.
Thank you, Alice. As I mentioned, exceptions for trade restrictive measures that aim at the protection of human, animal, plant life and health, or relate to the conservation of natural resources like clean air or the marine environment, are an integral part of WTO law, and therefore measures that restrict the importation of plastic waste, for instance, may be considered admissible under WTO law, even without a multilateral environmental agreement. But chances arguably increase to a great extent if the measures are covered by the Basel Convention, which restrict the importation of plastic waste. And this is because the WTO agreements are an integral part of public international law and are to be interpreted as such, not in isolation, but in accordance with customary rules of interpretation of public international law. And therefore, any subsequent agreement between the parties regarding the interpretation of the treaty or the application of its provisions and any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relation between the parties must be taken into account when interpreting the WTO agreements. This means that with regard to a measure between two WTO members, which are both parts of the Basel Convention, this is a very relevant source of interpretation. So trade restrictive measure, which is covered by the Basel Convention, arguably a panel or an adjudicatory body would find that it's in line with WTO provisions. And even in a case where not all WTO members are parties to the Basel Convention, still this multilateral environmental agreement has a nearly universal membership, which indicates a genuine and globally recognized environmental problem and reflects response agreed on by the international community, even if not by all WTO members. And in line with this, the adoption of the plastic waste amendments would influence how we understand trade restrictive measures based on this convention. And as a last point, when you seek to justify a measure under WTO rules, one relevant consideration is of procedural nature, whether the party enacting a trade restrictive measure was involved in discussions with all members that are for which it is relevant. And given that we have a global, nearly global agreement, it could be safely contended that adequate opportunities have been provided to all exporting members to negotiate a common solution before resorting to trade restrictive measures. So I think these 3 points underline that the Basel Convention, even though it foresees measures that might restrict trade, do not conflict with WTO rules, but help us to interpret them.
Super. No, I think that's a useful underlining, right, of this point that, you know, the way WTO law has evolved, there is already a real effort to build some coherence between WTO trade rules and other multilateral environmental agreements that members may have signed. There's already an effort kind of from the WTO side to make that coherence happen. Speaking of the WTO, Aiko, I can see your hand up. So the floor is yours if you wanted to react or add something.
Yeah, no, actually, I had just had a different point. I just found the presentation by Paola really interesting on hidden plastics and more apparent plastics. And it just made me think a little bit more about like, what is the problem we're trying to address? And the most visible is trade in a way. But then, I just felt that it's important to say, let's not forget that why trade has so much plastics is because we have so much plastics even without trade, if that makes sense. Because in almost everything we do, all the goods that we have, and it seems to be a large proportion of goods contain plastics in some form or other. And so even if you got rid of trade and if you forgot about trade, you still have plastics and you still have plastics pollution. And what trade does is, it does amplify because you have more, the markets become bigger. So you have more transactions and you've got more flows. But it's not going to get at the primary problem, which is that plastics is, I think Caroline said this, or maybe it was Alice, plastics is very useful. It's a very useful material. It's very cheap and it's very useful. And it features in all manufacturing in some way or other. And I think that the slide by Paola showed it as well, that, Africa, consuming so-called large amounts of hidden trade in plastics because they don't manufacture that much. It doesn't mean that plastics is not existing in all the other countries that don't show up in the chart, but it just shows the fact that they have their domestic means of production. So therefore, they don't need to, in this case, import that much in terms of goods, but plastics is being produced. So it just seems to me that it's not a coincidence that you see this so-called hidden trade, because trade has expanded, manufacturing has expanded, plastics is used widely in manufacturing. So therefore, you put the two together, you see large flows of trade of plastics. So it just raises a question, I think, that what sorts of policies are we talking about and which policies are most effective? If one addresses policies just on trade, but has no policies looking at basically what we said earlier, the upstream production type issues, I don't see this problem disappearing, as such. And it raises another issue, which is technology that we don't seem to have discussed very much, which is, I'm not a big into technology, but it seems to me one answer would have to be in the technological field about simply because plastics is needed. I don't think one can say plastics is not needed, but we need to find ways to address the pollution and the large use of it in production. So anyway, I just threw those things out, maybe rambling a bit, but it just seems to me, just looking at it through trade is, yes, there is a factor here, but it's not the primary factor. The primary factor is how we use plastics in everything we produce. That was basically it. And lastly, just to Brigitta, I thanks very much for the presentation and everything. I think it's really important to think and talk about these issues and discuss them. And as you said, Alice, I think, I would like to think that there's a lot already has been integrated in WTO dispute jurisprudence in its awareness of environmental objectives and the need to pursue them. And lastly, thankfully, that there has been no dispute so far on an MEA provision and WTO rules, but there's a lot written about potential conflict. I think that's important to remind ourselves. It's more about potential rather than an actual case that has surfaced at WTO. Thank you.
No, quite right indeed, Carolyn. Carolyn, I can see your hand up. And in fact, I wondered if you also wanted to have a go at one of the questions in the chat, actually, which is from Gabriel, because he has asked if we could sort of encapsulate, forgive me, Gabriel, I'm going to paraphrase your question, but if we could identify 2 or 3 takeaways, maybe sort of specifically on the engagement of companies in international trade that we could present to a board. And I know you're not representing the private sector, but I know that you've spoken to a lot of them in the course of your research. So I wondered if you wanted to perhaps to reflect and help us understand a bit, kind of in the course of your research on the trade policy questions, in your discussions with the private sector and people who work very closely with the private sector, did there seem to be sort of particular areas of concern or particular areas of opportunity that came up in the course of your research from the private sector perspective? I thought I'd throw that question at you just because I thought you might have an answer to it. And then feel free, of course, to take the floor and comment on what you've heard so far.
Great, thank you very much. I will try and respond to Gabrielle's good question. I'm not the best position to answer it, I don't think, but just before then, I did want to respond to Ho's point. I mean, I completely agree on your point around production. So I think our point, with this panel is trade is a piece of a much bigger puzzle, and we just need to make sure that the trade policy world is doing its piece to contribute to solving this problem. And I think in other panels we've had yesterday, we put a lot of emphasis on the role of investment and finance strategies in shifting production around the world, both out of harmful production and into either production of better plastics or better designed plastics or new innovative materials and so on. So I think, to me, it's one of the toolboxes, it's one of the economic tools in the policy box that we need to look at. And so it's just a question of looking where it is strategically that trade policy can make a difference and where trade is particularly exacerbating problems. And here I think that, you're absolutely correct that, plastics are everywhere in so many products. There are many uses that are avoidable, excessive, and unnecessary. There are some that are really vital, and there are some that will take us many, many years to design our way out of. Others, it's just a matter of shifting incentives. If the feedstocks weren't so cheap, companies would make things out of something else. You can make car interiors out of natural fibers. You don't have to make them out of synthetic textiles. You can do all kinds of different, there are all kinds of different materials we can use, and we need to carefully examine also their environmental impacts across their life cycle, and they will also, generate waste issues. But I think the point here is that trade is a piece of that bigger puzzle. We'll also need to look at industrial policies and social policies, as Diana mentioned yesterday, if we're talking about transitioning out certain types of production. And I think we also need to bear in mind that at this point in time, we're not just looking at the plastic pollution problem in terms of waste, we're looking at it in terms of the chemical pollution in the production cycle of plastics, which is of enormous concern to affected communities. Think of Cancer Alley in the US and other places like that. There'll be many more Cancer Alleys in developing countries that we know nothing about. And we're also looking at the carbon footprint of plastics as well. So it's a really multi-dimensional challenge. And I think that looking at the production side is key. But I would just say on the trade side, it's also true that there are many countries who don't produce plastics and so are importing them, sometimes for very important uses. But the key thing is that trade is adding to their plastic waste burden, both of waste and of products, and we need to better understand and manage that. There's no reason for countries to be importing environmentally harmful, toxic, or problematic plastics that they have no capacity to manage. And so we need to try and do something we can. There's a really specific trade dimension there. We can use trade, as Alice has said, to promote alternatives, to promote technologies for waste management and so on. But so just super quickly on, because I'm talking for too long, on Gabrielle's point around the private sector, here I think it's really important to note that we have different parts of the private sector involved in the plastic value chain. You have those who are producing primary plastics, those who want to produce, bio-based primary plastics, who want to put more recycled plastics into the system, and those who want to keep on producing more and more virgin plastics. So they all have different interests in this space. And at the other end, you have retail and brand companies who I don't think really care whether they use plastic or not. They just want to deliver their goods to the market in whatever packaging makes it most palatable to the consumers they're trying to reach. And so for them, they're hearing this pressure from consumers to use less packaging and are really keen, I think, to move in the right direction, but it's really complicated for them to do so. And they've really emphasized the need to have some kind of coordinated legislation and rules around the kinds of packaging, for instance, that they can put on the market in multiple jurisdictions, and to simplify the range of plastics that are used on the international market, which would facilitate recyclability. And I think the key thing for them is, they'd like to see more cooperative sort of standard setting around this so that they can actually make the shift that they want to see whilst not losing their market share for their core products. That's the impression I got, and I'm sure there's much that folks like you, Gabriel, who are working on the investment and finance side can help to do in that respect.
Super, thank you, Carolyn. Exactly what I hoped you'd be able to say, so very useful indeed. I'm conscious that we're coming almost to the very end of the time for this session. So what I might do just in the last sort of couple of minutes or so is just remind you of some of the information that's already in the chat space. You'll see that there's a little link asking you for some feedback on this session and also on the conference in general. So on behalf of the organisers, I'd encourage you to have a look at that. And there are also a couple of other messages about further events that the Graduate Institute and the TESS are organising. One, in fact, on Thursday this week, the 2nd of September, in collaboration with UNCTAD, and another series of events at the Geneva Trade Week. So if you go to the little chat box on the right-hand side, you'll see links to those as well. So perhaps the last thing left for me to say is that I hope you, like I have found this to be a really useful session, looking from the MEA's perspective at the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm conventions and what's going on there, how that links into WTO rules, both kind of should a dispute ever emerge, but also how it, the important work that's done in committees to exchange information and prevent disputes from happening, how much we know or don't know about the trade in plastic, both the plastic as it is as such and plastic and other products, and therefore what we might do in the trade policy community, not so much to try and resolve the plastic problem on our own, but to make a contribution to ensure the overall policy framework is coherent and that trade policy is part of a coherent policy framework in addressing the problem. So with that, thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation to moderate this session. I've had an absolute blast, and I hope you found it also very useful. So with that, thank you very much.